Okay, today we're continuing and starting chapter 1 of my book, Philosophy on Soil. I start with a quote from Ivan Illich, Sigmar Gronvald, Lee Hoynacki, and other friends from 1990. We stand on soil, not on earth. From soil we come, and to soil we bequeath our excrements and remains, and soil, its cultivation and our bondage to it, is remarkably absent from those things clarified by philosophy in our Western tradition. As philosophers, we search below our feet, because our generation has lost its ground in both soil and virtue. Imagining Eco-literate Music Pedagogy, Autumn 2003. A place of paradox. Riverview Park yields a seeming wilderness within the city. It's about a mile from my school. Partially fallen yellow maple leaves rustle below my feet. I take time to walk here after school. Slowly, softly, tranquilly, I walk. Walking becomes an aim, not a way to get elsewhere. Following a walking meditation described by Thich Nhat Hanh, a popular Buddhist author, I imagine lotus flowers bursting forth in my feet. Birds, mammals, and insects fill the soundscape, and trees muffle the sounds of nearby highways. Up the hill, the Allegheny Observatory embodies science's long gaze, advancing knowledge to the deepest reaches of mechanically mediated vision. Down the hill, ruins of a zoo rest, rusty relics of a bygone day. I walk in the simulated wilderness, a paradox of future and past. Today is a day for realization. On this walking meditation, my mind wanders. As I reflect on wilderness, bird songs accompany me. I catch sight of a small predator, a hawk. A herd of deer in the brush, dozens large, has become unafraid of me. Their footsteps are nearly soundless. The noisiest inhabitant of the park is a squirrel, who heedless of the stalking hawks, lives life fearlessly. There are lessons I learn here in living a good life. I open myself to receive those lessons. I listen. Walking, imagining. Suddenly, or maybe gradually, I realize this is not wilderness. Am I fooling myself? Perhaps it is the hawk and overabundance of deer drawing my attention to how safe I feel. No large predators, crucial for self-sustaining wilderness, reside here. The old remains were a reminder that a century previous this park was a meadow, and before that a farm, and these trees towering above me aren't indigenous inhabitants, but are younger, planted here to provide urban citizens with a wilderness simulation. Spiritually, I benefit from losing myself in the simulacrum. After a stressful workday with too many hours sitting at a piano or desk teaching and grading, I walk and let simulated wilderness wash my tensions away. It's comforting to imagine ancient Iroquois meeting, hunting, and laughing together for generations under these same picturesque leaves, but it is an untruth. The shade provided by the Norway maples is not the shade those Iroquois knew. Indigenous trees were cleared for farming, for sustenance. Sadly, so were most of the Iroquois. My daily meditations would be less relaxed if wild wolves and mountain lions were not eradicated. Long after the land was used for sustenance, it rested, generally uncultivated, hence the abundance of invasive species. Perhaps it is best to realize that city parks have more in common with gardens than wilderness. Walking here helps me realize wilderness areas are important, and perhaps I shouldn't be walking on actual wilderness. There should be a place where humans don't walk. I wonder how much real wilderness, humanless expanses remain on our planet. How much should there be? These are political questions. Lost in speculations, I was cultivating ecological consciousness. Walking provides me a conscious experience on soil. Ecological literacy begins with cultivating myself, but it cannot end there. I should do more than walk to find answers to my questions about wilderness. I should read, talk, listen, change. Autumn 1983. A mother stands with her children. The casket, surrounded by flowers, rests near a wall. Crying, her father, a lifelong carpet layer, has recently passed. The family returned from Maryland to rural Pennsylvania for the funeral. Dad was involved in building both Patton Park and Prince George's State Park. The young boy listens silently, closely. A lesson in death and life takes root. The parks, trees, and wildlife Grandpa protected can stand as monuments. Even if only in my mind, I will appreciate them. Spring 2015. Walking in Tudeck Park with my young son, we echo birds. As a stay-at-home dad, I wrote a dissertation with my son sitting on my lap. He's becoming more active, more independent. What do I want to pass on to my son? What's important? What's virtuous? Standing on soil, I search below my feet. There, I see, hear, and feel life. Philosophy on soil. Historian and philosopher Ivan Illich problematized the institution of Christian values in Western society. He suggests, quote, the institutionalization of values leads inevitably to physical pollution, social polarization, and psychological impotence, three dimensions in the process of global degradation and modernized misery, end quote. And that's from 1970. Schooling is one example. People have learned reading, math, music throughout history without institutions. Speaking generally, learning is good. As something we value, it can be called a value. Schools confound the value with institutions. Education commodifies learning by institutionalizing it. For Ivan Illich, environmental damage is the expected result. In contrast, a philosophy on soil is centered on traditions and place. Actions are virtuous to the extent that choices are made and practices mutually, quote, mutually recognized as being good within shared local culture and enhances the memory of a place, end quote. Music education is not immune from the institutionalization of values. Professional educators teach students to presume music education, developing students into homo educandus musicae. She who believes music education is a basic human need, everybody ought to be music educated, and that music education is a prerequisite to meaningful musicking. Reformers often include more diverse and popular musical genres, but seldom challenge institutionalization itself. Illich contends education is a sacred cow. Quote from 2012, they all want more education, directed towards the sector which they represent. And we fight now in the name of education against a teaching profession that unwillingly constitutes an economic interest. End quote. For musics, when a new genre is included in schools, people redefine themselves as non-musicians in regard to that genre. Schools, and not families and communities, or another naturally occurring organization of humans, label some people as experts and everybody else not. It seems like hubris to believe schooling institutions can take a place of a living musical cultures in educating the next generation. Schooling happened with classical music and more recently with jazz. At the current rate of institutionalization, we can expect future generations of hip-hop and bluegrass musicians to need diplomas. And hubris will pile upon hubris as these musicians become the institutionalized experts. Providing more music education delivered by unwilling propagators of economic interests is probably counterproductive if we want more musicking in communities. Perhaps we need to quote, ask which society, which education, which form of religion is beneficial for all life on the planet as a whole, end quote, and that's Arnie Ness. A study of small-scale local music learned somewhere besides music education institutions, might show a way forward for music education. That way forward will likely be rooted in humility, recognizing virtuous limits for our profession. And Shirley Steinberg quote, "An understanding of indigenous ways of seeing encourages rethinking the purposes of education," end quote. Abro Kwa in 1999 shared 3 African environmental songs that honor Mother Earth and suggested that environmental and social factors guide indigenous African music. Matsunobu in 2009 notes the Japanese shakuhachi flute making, quote, is interdependent on the natural resources available in each place and cannot occur without a sustainable relationship with the land, end quote. To reroot music education in soil, teachers might humbly study the songs and teaching practices of the other to understand how indigenous people come to know their environments and live sustainably through music. Students might critically examine their local places, urban, suburban, and rural, to identify how the music they learn outside of school are locally and globally oriented. Identify what this music says about living sustainably where they live, and challenge the ethical value of musics and practices that are unsustainable. This is a reorientation of musics and society. Each is a reflection of the other. I recognize that a possible paradox exists when studying indigenous cultures as ecologically sustainable. While many, even most indigenous groups live sustainably, it is unlikely they all do. North American Paleo-Indians' arrival in the Americas about 11,500 years ago coincided with the extinction of large mammals, such as mammoth and mastodons. These groups seem to have influenced the distribution of trees, creation of grasslands, and the erosion of soil. The global megafauna extinction is increasingly blamed on human activities. I can't help but see parallels between then and today. The unprecedented species loss we experience in our century is called the Sixth Great Extinction. Facing the Sixth Great Extinction, teachers and students would do well to look at all practices they intend to bring to school and identify those that are most sustaining. Many indigenous groups today live on the forefront of environmental activism. The indigenous environmental music movement provides a unique and integrated approach to environmental justice in the United States. With a shared experience of being invaded and relocated, the movement challenges ideas of land use, capitalism, and ecological sustainability, creating a counter-hegemonic alliance against mining and manufacturing. Further, in the fight for ecological sustainability, indigenous groups embrace diverse notions of environmental justice, modeling a community-based, capability-centered conception of environmental justice. Along with humility, problematizing institutions, and recognizing paradoxes, cultural diversity seems to typify the philosophy on soil metaphor, as soil is made up of diverse and interconnected species of bacteria, fungi, algae, worms, insects, and mammals. Soil is a local and diverse community. All of these living organisms are active agents in the soil community. The soil community is a powerful metaphor for music education and advances as decentralized, diverse, agentic, and interdependent. The soil produces music. Though many of the musics of soil agents are inaudible to humans, some are not. The music of insects such as termites tapping and crickets scraping, perhaps the most thought-provoking inaudible sound humans experience is the sound of the Big Bang. Even today, the imprint in the way galaxies are clusters mirrors an intense sound waves created by the Big Bang. An audible model was first produced in 2003. See Kramer. Even though it is not a sound we can hear every day, it is fascinating to reflect that our daily life is accompanied by a tone that begun at the dawn of time. This unaudible drone underlines the audible musics of streams, waves, winds, and of us. Music educators, music's often displace local musical cultures, labeling young people as non-musicians and a small group of people as musicians, and reifies a hierarchy of musical genres. Further, through our institutions, children learn to value distant places in music, becoming uprooted from well-known soil. But we are bound to the soil, bound to actual places and foods grown and musics performed by people we can see, hear, and touch. To reroot music education on soil will mean reassessing values, critically reconsidering music education history, and changing practices from large to small, centralized to decentralized, and universal to local. Rooted musicking practices might replicate what Duval and Sessions called earth bonding rituals, celebrating specific places. Teachers can begin by recognizing the kinds of ignorance produced by schools, listening to rooted musical cultures, beginning with urban, rural, and indigenous peoples, the social majorities, for sustainable ways of musicking well on soil. Creative vignette. He begins the general music class by telling a story. My dad used to take me to the same fishing hole each spring on the first day of trout. We would walk as we walked down the railroad tracks to the near dark of the early morning. Turning left at the point with no noticeable markers, we hiked through the high grass, one in front of the other. When we approached the sandy bank, we got quiet. We climbed down a small incline to the water. We put worms to hook and checked our watches. The sun slowly arose through the gnarly and ancient trees, and fog floated above the water. The creek flowed slowly here. A thick bush hung over the dark water. For what seemed like a long time, we sat and waited. Trout season started at 8. If you wanted to crowd near the dam, you could show up 15 minutes early. But when you'd spend the morning shoulder to shoulder untangling your line, I learned from a young age our private hole was valuable enough to leave before dawn. There was plenty of time to sit and listen to the early morning bird songs, ducks, crows, sparrows. My favorite, black-capped chickadees, repeatedly sung their descending hole steps. Cheeseburger! When it was time, we cast our lines into the creek. Every time I hear the chickadees singing the descending song, I remember the first day of trout. I am there, sitting on a cold stump, baiting my line, waiting for 8. I wouldn't trade a minute of that time for the world. Handing out a lead sheet, he plays a composition for the class he wrote, inspired by the experience. Explaining his composition process, he found an online recording of black-capped chickadees calls on Wikipedia Commons. Sitting at the piano, listening to the recording, he improvised a chord progression and later a melody. Then, using GarageBand, he added synthesizer sounds, producing an introduction on tape that would lead in the compose and improvise sections. Students began reflecting on nature sounds and compose their own musics.